Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The next jail song, and it's spelled, in fact, in the Book of English Folk Song, Penguin Book of English Folk Song, G-A-O-L, jail. It's called, Step Up, Young Man, I Know Your Face, It's Nothing in Your Favor. Step up, young man, I know your face, it's nothing in your favor. A little time I'll give you 6 months unto hard labor. Give me hip holiday, give me hip holiday, oh. At 6 o'clock the turkey comes in with a bunch of keys all in his hand. Come, me lad, step up and climb the wheel to turn and the car to go right. Give me hip holiday, give me hip holiday, oh. At 8 o'clock our skilly comes in, sometimes thick and sometimes thin, but the devil a word we dare not say, or it's bread and water all next day. Give me hip holiday, give me hip holiday, oh. At 8:30 the jangle rings, into the church boys we must swing, down on our bended knees to fall. The Lord have mercy on us all. Give me hip holiday, give me hip holiday, oh. At 9 o'clock the turkey comes in with a bunch of keys all in his hand. Come, me lad, step up and climb the wheel till breakfast time. Give me hip holiday, give me hip holiday on the veranda. Saturdays come, I'm sorry to say, Sunday is our starvation day. Our hotnails loose and our tin mugs too. They are not clean, no they will not do. Give me hip holiday, give me hip holiday, oh. Now 6 long months are over and past, I will return to me bonny lass. I leave the turkey all behind, the wheel to turn and the corn to grind. Give me hip holiday, give me hip holiday, oh.
Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast, Nothing Sacred, is to dive into Fyodor Dostoevsky's House of the Dead. In particular, we're going to look at Book 9, Baklushin's story. I have a specific direction I should like to take our discussion in the time ahead, and one of those is pertinent to your obligatory announcement each and every broadcast from what I think is an amazing website. It's one of my favorite websites, ApocatastasisInstitute.wordpress.com. So much going on this site. Around and round the wheel goes. Where does it stop? Well, I think appropriate to yourself, who obviously has some interest in literature, or you wouldn't be watching this. We have an evening coming up looking at Oscar Wilde on suffering. And in fact, this presentation is moving myself, at least, in that direction. I'm trying to get my mind together on various points. And when I read Book 9 from the House of the Dead by Fyodor Dostoevsky, I was impressed by a later inmate, that is Oscar Wilde, and his recollections and artistic contribution towards his time in prison and prison literature, respectively. So, if you go to our main website and also our Open Events and Sappho Center sites, you'll see the same replicated there. You have a write-up of what's on deck. It's a $10 event. All this money helps to go and build materially the school. There's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes in terms of campus acquisition that also involves certain financial things like investments and also grants. And to get grants, you have to have other things in hoc, other things set up. So all of this money that goes towards our campus comes from things like these open events. More importantly, on your end, events such as wild on suffering contribute to your personal intellectual growth and personal growth, and conversely, enrich our school community. There are definite downsides to the use of the online infrastructure. Of course, we are primarily a physical school here in Connecticut, campus or no. That doesn't stop us from meeting in the cafes and parks and greens. I don't know if you know what a green is outside of New England, but in any case, in-person learning is always preferred. However, the online is a possibility, as it will be in the instance of wild on suffering. All of that is to say, before we move on to our presentation, that one of the distinctive downsides of online learning and an online school or an online part of a school is the lack of community. People fritter in and out, and we have to work, myself included, especially hard to keep our academic community healthy, especially at a distance and telephonically, as we are communicating right now. So there you go, wild on suffering. We're going to be looking, as we do every Easter time here at Apocatastastis, every Holy Week and Good Friday and Easter time, I should say, at Wilde's poem, The Ballad of Reading Jail, his topically related essay, De Profundis, and every year, just to spice it up, we toss in some other somewhat random, but not really random, aspect of Wilde and his very extensive body of literature. So we're going to look at the two pieces just mentioned in regards to his children's literature. And we'll see a lot of thematic overlay. All right. Oscar Wilde, incidentally, is one of the very few authors that has a notable work in every genre of literature: poetry, essay, prose, play, ballad. Quite a remarkable man. Okay, so there we go. And you might want to just bookmark. This should just be your homepage. This is my homepage, and I find myself always going back to the beautiful Apocatastastis site. Okay, enough self-aggrandizement. Here we are. We're looking at Fyodor Dostoevsky's text, The House of the Dead. We'll bring up a short summary. This is not what we're here to do. There are much more competent summaries and introductions to The House of the Dead. We'll have a little bit of that, but you can look elsewhere for the who, what, when, where, how, and why. What we're delving today in particular are some themes, again, related to the Wilde program coming up, and then just where my research is in other areas. I happen to be writing a chapter for a book of essays with many other contributors on the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the fallout of that and what really happened. And the tack I find that I'm taking, and it's most appropriate to these remarks on the House of the Dead, the tack and where my mind is drawn with the Charlie Kirk event is postmodernity and the collapse of the sense of time and the extraordinary. And that allows me to contrast time periods. And the time period when Dostoevsky's writing in the mid-19th century is modern. And we are postmodern. And one of the major differences, I think, has to do with the perception of time. And a lot of that has to do with the concept of media. In the 19th century, you are reading. And your reading is very long form because of certain changes that happen to living patterns in the 18th and 19th century. So you have long blocks of work and long blocks of leisure, which eventually will be bastardized as a horrible substitute called free time. And I don't have too many cuss words that I avoid. Never trust a man who doesn't swear. But free time is one of the most vulgar, disgusting terms because it pretends to be leisure. Leisure and free time are not the same thing. And I will not digress on that point. But as regards to how people use their time, when they are not working for a wage master, a capitalist, in the 18th and 19th centuries, often will appear and will be with them reading. And so books get very long because you have long winter nights and long summer nights and long summer afternoons and whatever when you're off the clock. And so you have this aspect of 19th century literature is very long form. And that changes the way you perceive time. And the way we perceive time now has to do with how we interact with media, which is largely audiovisual. Even the verb to read has been collapsed into listening, right? People will read an audiobook. And I'm not knocking audiobooks. You see this little microphone guy here where my cursor is? That's my best friend. That's my best friend. That reads at 3 times speed, whatever articles or whatever prep that I need to have done. But I can tell you, as someone who insists with all the read aloud apps you please on setting aside a certain part of my day for actual reading, that actual reading is a completely different activity and has a completely different effect on one's mind than the read aloud app or audiobooks have. They have their place, but they are two completely different things. We say in America apples and oranges. They say in Europe chalk and cheese. You get the point. So a lot here in the meta sense of Dostoevsky and reading patterns. And that, of course, also influences the whole prison literature of the 19th century, which is something else that strikes me. Why you had so many notable authors talking about the subject of confinement. And before we get too long in the tooth, let's just dip our toe into just a basic exploration of this text here, just from Wikipedia, just so we get our hand on the steering wheel, toe in the water. I'm just drowning. I'm drowning in similes. I think Orwell has an essay to that effect of how similes are far too overused, and then we have the mixed metaphor or the simile inside the simile that doesn't quite work and needs another simile to save it. Anyway, hand on the rudder that we have. We'll just read a little bit here. The House of the Dead is a semi-autographical, biographical novel published in 1860 in the journal Vremya by Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. It has been published in English under various titles. The novel portrays the life of convicts in a Siberian prison camp. It is generally considered to be a fictionalized memoir, a loosely knit collection of descriptions, events, and philosophical discussions organized around the theme and character rather than plot, based on Dostoevsky's own experiences as a prisoner in such a setting. Dostoevsky spent 4 years in a forced labor prison camp in Siberia for his conviction for involvement in the Petroshenski Circle. This experience allowed him to describe with great authenticity the conditions of prison life and the characters of the convicts. So this Petroshenski Circle was a group of liberals, kind of Owenites, as we had them in America, kind of utopian liberals, reformists, socialist sorts. Actually, they weren't liberals. Socialists aren't liberals in the proper sense, but they were reformists, very much so. And you get Tolstoy and a whole kind of subgenre in Russia at this time, obviously influenced by things that are happening in Western Europe and North America. Okay, anything else that we need to know? I think that'll do. Again, there are many much more in-depth and competent explorations here, but we see we're dealing with a prison memoir, and then there was an interesting point here that's worth delving into. So there are 3 things, and I'll recap these, that I present to you here. And one of them was mentioned, here we go, the House of the Dead is organized around theme and character rather than plot. So, when we're looking at this text, and particularly Book 9, the bathhouse scene, we are looking at three things for this recording, one of which is the perception of time vis-a-vis the 19th century. The second of which is, why do authors spend so much time in the 19th century, major authors, on the prison theme? And then the third point is the use of character to move the story forward. In a sense, that's the driving tool, if you like. All right, so the first point, time. Time in the 19th century, again, we're looking at the meta here, and we're plugging this in especially to comments about our coming Oscar Wilde look at suffering and his time in prison. Time is something that changes radically in the 18th and 19th century. So the first point that we want to look at is time in the House of the Dead, particularly Book 9, and we'll shimmy-shammy over to that soon enough. Time is something which changes in the 18th and 19th century quite dramatically. And that has to do with the rise of industrialism. And then also, as regards still the vast majority of the population on farms and on the sea in terms of fishing and things of that nature, the eventual echoing out or rippling out of industrial machines into these other vocations, which also changes the perception and interaction with time. By the early 19th century, you have also changing travel patterns. The steam train and the steam ship will speed up time and will change perceptions of time for the passenger. We don't think about this. We maybe give a glancing thought to, can you give a glancing thought? Now I'm becoming self-conscious about my metaphors. Can you give a glancing thought? Well, we will here. You can give a glancing thought nowadays, maybe to the effect that iPhones have had in our lives, and we've seen that in the past 2 decades, not even 2 decades. But we don't think of earlier inventions having a similar disruptive effect. And trains and steamships had that in their day. And the passenger on such a contraption is seeing the world move at a pace past him that he has never seen in human history. No one had ever moved that fast, except in any time before. If you were moving that fast, you were going to die. Either your carriage had gotten out of control or was rolling down a hill, or you were falling off of something very high. In those instances, yes, you would be moving that fast. But in terms of travel, things that anchor you, time and space, are completely turned up on their head with something as simple and we would say as primitive as an 1830s steam engine or steamship. We hardly think of these things as disruptive or innovative. We look with nostalgia on the paddle wheel. In fact, that's a whole little niche and nuke of tourism in these United States. Are these quaint ways to travel. You can pay Indian man and Muslim man and China man a lot of money around Central Park in New York City, dressed up, China man dressed up as like a Victorian. I'm not joking. You go to Central Park. Go to Central Park and you'll see Jose, Ali, Ching Chong, and they're all dressed up in this Victorian regalia. And some of them have monocles. Some of them look like the Mr. Monopoly man, and they have monocles, and they'll come into my carriage, sir. Take off the top hat. You're some dude from Japan or something. And laugh as much as you want. He's laughing all the way to the bank because those carriage rides cost a lot of money, and there are a lot of gullible, or maybe not so gullible, tourists that are very happy to make Ali and Mohammed and Jamal a lot of money for driving them around in a quaint old carriage around Central Park. And once in a while, a taxi cab or a police car will crash into one of the horses there, and then you'll really have a memorable story. And if you go on the Mississippi River here in America, you will also have a similar ability to empty your wallet for these so-called quaint travel vehicles. But they were not quaint in their day. The paddle wheel and even the carriage with springs, modern springs, to say nothing of early replica cars. These are like the Terminator robots of their time. These are completely upending. So time changes in any instance. And also on the more organizational aspect of these machines, you also have, therefore, the invention of the time zone. And so, indeed, perceptions of time and place are completely changed. So it's interesting to me, to our third point, skipping over for a moment, number 2, it's interesting for me that in this time of great disruption in the 19th century, you have a disruption, again, specifically of time and space, location, because of these vehicles. It's interesting to me that the prison genre obtains. And actually, this is the second point I wanted to mention. So there you go. The third point has to do with the character-driven aspect. So the first point is time change. The second point is the prominence of the prison theme in writing of this period. And I think it's directly connected to the first points. So you have this upending of location and temporality. And well, guess what gives you those in abundance? The prison. The prison gives you stability in a way that you probably didn't want. And so we see that maybe artistically as a pull in the opposite direction. I think there's obviously much more going on in the respective stories, whether that's the Count of Monte Cristo or various of Victor Hugo's stories or various of Dostoevsky's stories or Oscar Wilde and his input. I think this aspect from point 1 is appropriate. And then, of course, there are other themes these authors get into. Another aspect, and this is very appropriate to the writing project I alluded to with Charlie Kirk, that I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to modernity, which for introductory reasons, I often say to the high school kids and whatnot, I often say modernity is from Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, October 31st, 1517, to the dropping of the atomic bomb, August 15th, 1945. Modernity is Luther to the atomic bomb. And one thing that differentiates pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernity is definitions. Modernity is obsessed with defining things. And pre-modernity, this is a bathhouse, by the way, in the Russian style. This is what Dostoevsky lays out for us, minus whip marks and brand marks on the faces of the subjects. Specificity is something that the pre-modern world and our postmodern world lacks. That's one of the definitive differences from modernity. Modernity, with a very Protestant flavor, is interested in words containing truths. And from that observation flows a whole world of journaling, of writing, reading, and a very text-oriented society. To some of my writing projects now, and I'm just playing off of Marshall McLuhan in some of these observations and others like him. These are not original thoughts. But the collapse of everything into television, or into telephonia, if you like, into the screen, the collapse of all of life into the immediate now. I believe it's Marshall McLuhan who phrases this as what is television. And when I say television, I don't mean just the box in your living room. I mean all of telephonia. Everything from the telegraph to your implanted microchip that will broadcast Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg into your brain. Elon Musk, no doubt. Wait till Elon Musk's Neuralink takes off, right? You can't go on this gentleman's Twitter website, so-called X, and not see his face at the top. Every single post when you sign on to this Twitter is Elon Musk is pinned at the top. His latest ramblings, his latest thoughts on nothing he can have expertise on whatsoever. Howsoever, modernity is very different. Things are defined. They're hierarchical. And this goes back partially to the drinking in of the written word. The written word takes reading loud apps aside. The written word takes time to do properly, which is why if you listen to audiobooks and read aloud apps, you still need to set aside a certain amount of your day for good old-fashioned actual reading. And you'll find yourself being able to make distinctions automatically. It doesn't really matter what you're reading. It could be the lightest pulp you please. You will find yourself making distinctions because that's necessary to the reading process. And it's long form, and you're chewing over things in a way that you simply cannot in telephonia. Interestingly, in the past week of this broadcast in March of Holy 20 and 26, interestingly, I read a trade article from publishers, and they pointed out that the pulp aspect of that field is done. Pulp printing, that is to say, this very 20th century mass market, right? You've heard of mass market paperbacks. These were very inexpensive books that were often they were always produced in paperback, often with shoddier quality paper, but they would last a while, and you can put them in your pocket, paperback pocket. You can put in your purse. There was a term they had for that, pocket books or something. Not purses, but anyhow. And yeah, the only they could last actually quite a while. The only thing you had to mind was the yellowing of the cheap paper, the acidization of the cheap paper. Anyway, don't worry about that anymore because trade paperbacks are a thing of the dinosaurs at this point. They're not moving because the population isn't reading anymore. That's what that means. They are reading, but the people who are reading are less, and they're reading less, and they also have, conversely, more money to spend. So there's a lot of changes going on. But the reading culture that some of us knew from the 80s and the 90s, and that was pretty decrepit itself, that is indeed a dinosaur. Anyway, it's a dinosaur to the original point I was making, to the fact that telephonia levels everything to McLuhan's perception of everything all the time now. And contrast that to Dostoevsky in The House of the Dead, and this is perfect for prison literature. Contrast that to what reading does, which is to define things. And you're going to spend, I think, you can spend probably 10 or 15 hours, depending how fast you read, going through this full book. And that, in a sense, not a perfect sense by any means, but it gives you a sense in a certain reenactor tone of voice, to the length of a prisoner and his stay. You're not just watching a prison scene for 5 minutes, right? There's some perception, however imperfect, having spent 15 hours with a book, of traveling with the book, of almost being like a prisoner to the book. So there's all of this aspect. And I think that we have much to chew over here when it comes to the time stuff, but also the definition topic as well. You may have known this about borders. In the medieval world, I'm talking boundaries between kingdoms, eventually nations. In the medieval and ancient world, you have things called marshes, and these are no man's lands. In a sense, or at least lawfully, no man's lands. These are borderlands. They're limbo. And something that you see as you move into modernity is the marshes, these gray areas, these liminal areas between one kingdom and another. Perfect for outlaws, by the way, similar to the American city of Laredo, at least in mythology. Half the people in Laredo are Mexican criminals coming into America, and half of the other people in Laredo are Americans running out of Dodge to get into Mexico, to get away from the law, right? This is a liminal area. It's an in-between area. It's a statelet, as the State Department lists it these days. A principality. These are actually words the modern geopoliticians use. Anyhow, why is that? Well, because modern statecraft doesn't allow for marshes, doesn't allow for gray areas. The medieval does. The ancient does. I alluded to colloquially limbo, right? Laredo is like a limbo. The marsh is like a limbo. Well, guess what? Isn't that interesting? In ancient and medieval Christianity, you do have this intermediate area between heaven and hell in the Christian mythology. And in the West, that becomes purgatory, and then limbo is a little bit different, and it doesn't concern us the specifics. But the point is, you have these in-between areas. Neither one or the other. That's the medieval mind. That's the ancient mind. In the Eastern Christians, they have the toll houses, right? You are neither in heaven or hell. You might even get bumped down to hell, depending on how folk influenced you want your mythology of the toll houses to be. And I'm sure this causes a bit of anxiety to Orthodox theologians and monks and the official clergy, some of the folk takes on the toll houses, because I have heard of simple Orthodox people probably saying theologically incorrect things about that idea, that you almost have like this video game. So I mean, that's what the toll houses are overall. You die, and then they're all like these 20 challenges the devils will trick you with, and different saints will come to your rescue if you can break open the right box or whatever. I mean, it really is like a video game. And in some of this folk consciousness, and this is appropriate just to the larger Russian Orthodox ethos of Dostoevsky, who changed a lot after his time in prison, but yeah, I've heard it very theologically problematic. People saying, well, you could fail one of the toll house challenges and go to hell. I don't think that's what Orthodoxy teaches, but yeah, definitions. And so on the opposite end, where I'm doing my writing on Charlie Kirk and some of the pop culture influence of this, it's very interesting. Everything all at once now. What does Telephonia do to us? It equally is breaking down boundaries of all sorts. You see this blurring of dressing nice in public, speaking in a certain way in public. In the past year, I've noticed cussing of a rather rough variety. Don't trust a man who doesn't swear, by the way. But in terms of decorum, at the same time, there are words and not even just your typical four-letter words that you would not have heard, and they are routinely mentioned on live television, in political speeches, on the clock, state governors, state senators, presidents, using, yes, those four-letter words and other things in commercials. Very, very interesting, because everything has to collapse in Telephonia, because you're like in the ancient medieval world, in the telephonic postmodern society. how to see? That's a whole other discussion. I don't want to derail things, but appropriate to the House of the Dead and to our look at chapter 9, specificity, and we can have a whole discussion on the legal system and so forth. But that is ultimately what you see here. And just like we had with Behan, who I guess continues this theme into the 20th century, prison memoirs and things, Brendan Behan in the Quare Fellow, we have almost the opposite consciousness of, okay, so the prison life is super specific. In fact, I saw just a kind of documentary yesterday. They have parts of the hall that they're the prisoners. It's like a lane, on they have on the highways the high capacity lane that nobody ever uses for carpooling. They had that. I saw in a prison documentary for prisoners. So the prison staff, there was no barrier. It was just a tape on the floor. But the prison staff had 2/3 of the hallway, and then the prisoners were to be on the last third of the hallway, and super specific. And there were other examples, in fact, I can think of that came up, and we see that in the House of the Dead. And yet, there is a artificiality and an inhumanness to this. And so the human spirit is going to assert itself. And we see that in all prison literature, and certainly in the House of the Dead. We see that the human life, including bathing, here's a picture of an old Russian sauna as well, a little bit overexposed in the lighting, but here you go. And you see that with humor. Humor comes up again and again. We see that in our look at book 9, wherever I've squirreled it away. Here we go. With Baklushin's story, we see that as they're ribbing the Jew as he comes into the prison, and they're giving him a hard time. They're doing all sorts of jokes, and we see that throughout, that use of humor, sometimes gallows humor, that the human spirit comes through, even in this completely artificial, overly specialized environment. All right. And of course, we have, not to introduce a whole proper theme beyond the 3 we've laid out. Once again, those are the change of time and space, and why that leads to the 19th century focus again and again and again on prison topics. And then our last piece will be some meditation that'll come back to me. But something just to add here is Russia in the 19th century is this cauldron of the old and the new. As is Western Europe, and to a lesser extent, I think the battle was decided by this point in North America between the new and the old, and the new won. This is a new world, and it's new not just in terms of land that was not known before, but also new in terms of living patterns and political arrangements. Western Europe is certainly having this tug of war in all sorts of ways, and Russia, who was much less influenced by the Enlightenment, despite Catherine the Great and the likes of her. Russia was very much this real tug of war between the old and the new, much like you're probably seeing an analog in the Islamic societies over the past 20 years now. Dostoevsky is an example of that, this idealistic utopian freethinker, and has to go to jail. I mean, that's what provides the inspiration for this very text and for pretty much the rest of his work, whether that's the Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, and others besides. So the last thing I'd like to do here is to look at this famous scene from Book 9. And this is the bathhouse scene. It's been likened by commentators to Dante's Inferno. And with that, we have another connection between this literature altogether. And that is, we'll see it in Wilde's observation coming up, very much influenced by Dante. And this meditation of suffering for no point. That's going to be very interesting. Wilde and Dostoevsky are changed very much by their time in prison. And yet part of the whole prison milieu is that for most people, this is not going to have that effect on them whatsoever. You have the recidivist prisoner. I mean, so what is the point? In post-Enlightenment prisons, the purpose is supposed to be to reform people. You're supposed to end with the mutilations and so forth, in order that the person can be rehabilitated. In America, I don't know what these things are called elsewhere, but in America, our prisons are called penitentiaries. They are houses for penitents. Well, in the Christian mythology, the penitent doesn't stay penitent forever. The penitent, in fact, as of this recording, very soon in the Christian liturgy, the penitents will be received back into the church on Palm Sunday, traditionally. The altar server used to knock on the outside door of the church 3 times. And that's an allusion to way back when the public penitents, there used to be people, after they went to confession, couldn't come back into church for so many months or so many years. They would have to do often very extravagant penances, sometimes going to fight the Crusades or to go to a far-off shrine. They might die. But if they came back, they would be received back into the church. Penitence is not a permanent condition. That's a whole other topic. Ooh, that's a rich topic. That is a feature of modernity. And I would say this is carrying over even more so into the bizarre thing called postmodernity, which is not simply a reset to the medieval or classical mindset. It has similarities, but there are some major differences. And one of those is in modernity and postmodernity, contrasted to the previous dispensations, you are never completely forgiven. Go back to Jean Valjean in Les Miserables. He has to show his papers everywhere. That's a running theme. And we see that now with different crimes and registries, sex offender registries, and now violent offender registries, and now car offender registries. They're called points on your license. They don't quite call them a registry in these free states of America. Yes, in modernity and postmodernity, you're never actually forgiven. Your punishment might be reduced. You might go on parole, but you're always on the hook. So the penitentiary, I guess that's a bastardization, because you're never going to be rehabilitated. Either the system itself is going to destroy you, as Oscar Wilde says, it is only what is good in man that wastes and withers in prison. It is only what is good. And the chaff, the evil, is all that remains for the rest of his life. And it's a poetic way of observing that in the land of registries and all this jazz, you're never going to be completely rehabilitated, background checks and all of the works and pomps of tyranny. So, interesting that we have this scene. It's likened to Dante, because when people think of Dante, they think of hell. They think of Dante's Inferno. They forget that the poem goes on for twice as long in 2 other sections, the Purgatory and the Paradise. To my earlier point of earlier types of Christianity having intermediate, very medieval, very ancient ways of looking at heaven or hell. It wasn't just the bipolar. It was there was this marsh in between, the Purgatory. So interesting, in modernity, we have the penitentiary, but the penitent will never be completely redeemed. He will always be, in a sense, on parole, on some watch list, on some background check, whatever. And so it's interesting. The point I'm trying to make is it's interesting that this scene of a modern so-called penitentiary is likened to Dante's Inferno, because Inferno in the Christian mythology, hell is a place of no redemption, right? There is no point to it. If you try to give it a point, it sounds really weird, like God is enjoying the punishment of the damned, and that has all sorts of uncomfortable connotations. But there's nothing redemptive, even in Orthodox Christianities. There's nothing redemptive in the sufferings of the souls in hell. It's simply a suffering of justice. And so it's interesting. That's what I'm trying to say here. It's interesting that this monism, this ultimate lack of forgiveness that you see in hell, vis-a-vis God and the damned soul, you see likened to this scene of the modern prison, which is the modern state, and the modern so-called offender. The Dante Inferno allusion to this, and what I'm trying to say, and I'll move on with the reading, is that in both instances there is no redemption, no true redemption for the prisoner in modernity or post-modernity. When we opened the door to the bathhouse itself, I thought we were entering hell. Imagine a room 12 paces long and the same in breadth, in which perhaps as many as 100 and certainly as many as 80 were packed at once. So this bathhouse looks like this, right? So you have these benches, this tiled wall, tiled floors, these spigots for hot water, and then these buckets where you bathe yourself. You kind of sponge bathe yourself. And some of these can get quite elaborate in Russia and Central Europe and Turkey. This, as we found out earlier in our reading of Book 9, this is a bargain basement bathhouse. It sits next to the real bathhouse for the town. This is the really rundown one for poor people. He describes it at a certain point as having slime. He might even do it in this selection. Okay, in this room, in which perhaps as many as 100, certainly as many as 80 were packed at once, for the whole party were divided into only 2 relays. And we were close to 200. Steam blind. So they're stuffed in here. Steam blinding one's eyes. Filth and grime. The prisoners haven't bathed in forever. 200 of them stuffed in this hot room, right? So the filth and grime, it's in the air. You can smell it. What does this smell like, right? At least in the beginning. Such a crowd that there was not room to put one's foot down. So this is not just this roomy, modern sauna. This guy looks like he's having a good time. With extreme difficulty, we somehow forced our way to the benches round the wall, stepping over the heads of those who were sitting on the floor, asking them to duck to let us get by. But every place on the benches was taken. Petrov informed me that one had to buy a place and at once entered into negotiations with a convict sitting near the window. So in this whole book, everyone's just buying and selling the whole time. Interesting allusion to hell itself. For a kopeck, the latter give up his place, receiving the money at once from Petrov, who had a coin ready in his fist. He's butt naked, but he has a coin. He's thought to bring a coin in this bathroom, having providently brought it with him into the bathroom. The convict I had ousted at once ducked under the bench just under my place, where it was dark and filthy, and the dirty slime lay 2 inches thick. There we go. There's a visual for you. But even the space under the benches was all filled. There too the place was alive with human beings. Under the benches there was not a spot on the floor as big as the palm of your hand where there was not a convict squatting, splashing from his bucket. Others stood up from amongst them and, holding their buckets in their hands, washed themselves standing. Dirty water trickled off them onto the shaven heads of the convicts sitting below them. These guys haven't bathed in a long time, so that's not clean water. Let's put it that way. On the top shelf, and on all the steps leading up to it, the men were crouched. So if you see some of these bathhouses, they'll have these almost stages with benches on them. They'll be tiered. I imagine to alter how, the higher up you go, the hotter it'll be towards the ceiling. That's my imagination. They were huddled together, washing themselves, but they did not wash themselves much. Men of the peasant class don't wash much with soap and hot water. They only steam themselves terribly and then douche themselves with cold water. That is their whole idea of a bath. 50 birches were rising and falling. So that's what you see with this guy here, right? These are these birch boughs that they they beat themselves, not beat in a violent way, but stimulate their their muscles with. More steam was raised every moment. It was not heat, it was hell. All were shouting and vociferating, I like that word, to the accompaniment of 100 chains clanking on the floor. Dante, Dante, Dante. Some of them wanting to pass got entangled in other men's chains and caught in their own chains the heads of those below them. They fell down, swore, dragged those they caught after them. Liquid filth ran in all directions. Everyone seemed in a sort of intoxicated, overexcited condition. Imagine how happy you would be to have the heat and the steam, however grimy and greasy and slimy the environment is. There were shrieks and cries. By the window of the anteroom from which the water was handed out, there was swearing, crowding, and a regular scuffle. The fresh hot water was spilt over the heads of those who were sitting on the floor before it reached its destination. Now and then the mustached face of a soldier with a gun in his hand peeped in at the window or the half-open door to see whether there was anything wrong. The shaven heads and crimson steaming bodies of the convict seemed more hideous than ever. As a rule, the steaming backs of the convicts, pay attention, show distinctly the scars of the blows or lashes they have received in the past, so that all those backs look now as though freshly wounded. So the scar tissue, which had healed and was fine, it looks like it's been re-wounded because it's very red now, the scars on the back. And there's a lot of whipping that goes on here. I don't know if it's this chapter or earlier, but Dostoevsky mentions someone condemned to 4,000 lashes. And these would not be given all at the same time because you would obviously kill someone. So you would give them 100 or 200 at a time. And over the infliction of those 4,000, of course, you would build up a lot of scar tissue on your back. And the scars were horrible! Exclamation mark. A shiver ran down me at the sight of them. They pour more boiling water on the hot bricks, and clouds of thick hot steam fill the whole bathhouse. They laugh and shout. Through the clouds of steam, one gets glimpses of scarred backs, shaven heads, bent arms and legs, and to complete the picture, Isaac Fomitch is shouting with laughter on the very top shelf. He is steaming himself into a state of unconsciousness, but no degree of heat seems to satisfy him. For a kopeck, he has hired a man to beat him, but the latter is exhausted at last, flings down his birch, and runs off to douche himself with cold water. Isaac Fomitch is not discouraged and hires another and a third, and he is resolved on such an occasion to disregard expense and hires even a fifth man to wield the birch. He knows how to steam himself. Bravo, Isaac Fomitch! The convicts shout from below. Isaac Fomitch, for his part, feels that at the moment he is superior to everyone and has outdone them all. He is triumphant, and in a shrill, crazy voice screams out his tune, etc., etc. Tu autem Domine, miserere nobis, Deo gratias. Thus is Book 9 from The House of the Dead, Isaac Fomitch, The Bathhouse, and Baklushin's story. So we have a look there at all sorts of themes when it comes to this piece here. So the final point I would like to mention, and then I have to boogie-woogie to an appointment. The final point, and I did remember it in my hemming and hawing, is that I see, and I stand to be corrected, but I have in the back of my mind the awareness of a certain tradition that reaches its full-fledged grandeur in the 20th century in terms of literature, and that are travelogues. That is travelogues. And this character-driven story, often dealing with prison or low-class avocations, and we would put into this, starting towards our time, things like Hunter Thompson and Hunter S. Thompson, I think, Orwell, Down and Out in Paris and London, Road to Wogan Pier. I would put in Brendan Behan and the Borstal Boy, the Queer Fella, going backwards now. Also, A Long Journey to the End of Night, the French book by, I think the man's last name is Emile. And I'd kind of thought it was Long Journey to the End of Night that was the beginning of this tradition, but actually, I'm inclined to move the goalpost farther back to Fyodor Dostoevsky and the House of the Dead. The beginning of this way of telling stories, usually prison stories, but sometimes just travel amongst the low class, through character vignettes. And you can even take that up to a lot of modern travelogues. I'm thinking of A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson, which was a very popular book in the 1990s about the Appalachian Trail, which is a big hiking trail, which is not half an hour by way of car from here. In fact, well, maybe it is low class in the sense, I'm just saying this humorously, in the sense that I distinctly remember driving through Kent, Connecticut, which is a very wealthy hive and hideout for the rich and powerful. Henry Kissinger lived there. George W. Bush used to visit him on bended knee during the first Iraq War. Anyway, on the Appalachian Trail goes right through there. And I distinctly remember one summer driving, and this was, at like 30 miles an hour, driving past a group of hikers on the Appalachian Trail who had stopped by the side of the road, and I could smell them at 30 miles an hour going past. There was like a cloud. I guess it's appropriate to the bathhouse scene. There was like a cloud of stink around these dudes and dudettes that had been hiking in the summer the Appalachian Trail, and I'm sure they had a fun time of it and all. But I always remember that they say that your olfactory nerves are they're direct connected to the memory, and I can tell you with those fellas and those girls, that was definitely the case. And so just a funny anecdote there. But anyway, that was in the context that, you can bring this tradition of literature from the beginning at the House of the Dead, these character vignettes, bring it all the way up to Bill Bryson and The Walk in the Woods. And I'm sure there's 100 others of this, but I think this is a very definite literary tradition. Okay, well, I have to run the next school obligation. Please participate in Wild on Suffering. It's $10. It helps the university. And we have not a monologue. You don't have to deal with John Coleman talking. You want to talk, and you have much smarter things to say. So the lot of you, sign up. And if you have any questions, just write us. And I am out. Bye-bye.